What's going on, guys? Welcome to the Weightlifting Scoop. We're here tonight with Jim Rutter of Philadelphia Barbell, and he just wrote a new book called Keep Fighting. So I figured it would be a great time to jump on and talk to him about his new book. So how you doing, Jim?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the last book you wrote, "This Sport is Steroids," was really awesome. I enjoyed that one. This one's like a totally different structure than that one, but yeah, you definitely have a knack for writing because you have an academic background. So,
Mm.
um, yeah. So, uh, tell us a little bit about what made you wanna write this particular book.
A number of factors played into it. One of which was uh, at a meet in 2018. I had an athlete. She was getting ready to open at 100 kilos for the first time, lightweight female. And she turned to me as the announcer called her name and, with a look of terror, just said, "Please tell me I can do this." And it caught me off. It caught me off guard, and without because she had already medaled twice at senior nationals. She had done 100 kilos in training, and more than that, of course, in complexes, singles, I think even a double at that point. So I was surprised, and I thought, all right, I need to have mindset strategies at the tips of my fingers, ready to go if I face these kind of situations again. So I started reading and doing light research, reading mostly popular books at first, such as The Champion's Mind, How Champions Think, a book by Pete Temple, which I found very encouraging and illuminating. And one of the things that I started to discover, that with the exception of Temple's book, a lot of these books would center their discussion of mindset around anecdotes rather than strategies that an athlete could deploy in training and competition and in areas of life that where they would find utility. So I thought, around a couple of years later, after the steroid book that you mentioned had come out, I shifted my focus completely towards this book. So this was in spring of 21. And I thought, all right, the kind of book that I want to write needs to both explain and instruct and provide actionable strategies that an athlete can use in training, in competition, and in their general life to organize their habits and their beliefs and their attitudes around a career in weightlifting.
Yeah, and now from your experience in coaching or talking to other coaches about athletes, um, what I find is that some people compete really well and some people struggle
Mm-hmm.
with that, and obviously that's a skill. But even the people that compete well, sometimes they have a hard time bringing it day in and day out in training, right? So a lot of
Yes.
times someone is either an extreme competitor
Mm-hmm.
has a tough time in training, or they're like really good in training, and then the competition just like there's a different mindset. So I think either way, you can sort of take these strategies, even if you are someone who performs well in competition, you might be able to take some of these strategies and perform better in training, so you can hit higher percentages and prepare yourself for the meet a little better.
Yeah, I would agree because, as you well know, you've been in this sport 20 plus years at this point, and training offers us far more opportunities to push our boundaries, try out different technical approaches, and put higher weights on the bar than a competition ever will. We get what, 150, 200 snatches a week, 120 to 150 clean and jerks a week in training on a 5 or 6 day schedule. And you're right, you want to maximize those opportunities in training. And to that end, there is within my book, there are two chapters that run kind of parallel. They mirror each other. And one is a specific set of guidelines and strategies for those people who they're on fire in competition. And yet in the day-to-day routine of training, they struggle to summon that same energy and that same focus that a meet provides for them. And then in a latter section, I talk about how to translate success and preparation and training into competitive fire. So I try to offer strategies for each situation in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I actually didn't even realize that you had structured those separately. I read through
Hmm.
a little bit of some of this, but yeah, that question kind of came up organically, and that's just something that I've noticed about athletes, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really exciting to coach someone who always performs in competition, but it does always make you wonder, like, well, how can I teach them to bring that volition to training? And it's really hard, whether they're training
Yeah.
by themselves or they, even in a group, you just don't get that same, like, I have to do it today. But
Yeah.
also in training, like, you can't have adrenaline all the time. You kind of want to be even
Mm-hmm.
kill and be able to lift those big weights so that you get
Yeah.
that adrenaline spike in competition. But
Well, I think at the end of the day, most Americans train, and most people, in Europe and worldwide train in something that is very different from the Bulgarian system, where they're asked to go to, say, 80% on average rather than 90 or 95. So the necessity of having like constant spikes of adrenaline becomes more structured. Like the need to summon 100% every day is absent from most training days. And you're correct about that. But I think I'll give you two examples from coaching. I've coached two athletes that experience this need to perform better in training because they were always on fire in competition. And both of them were international level athletes. And it's interesting the factors that produce, that the literature shows produce like a low level training intensity versus the peak that they experience in competition. And the two that I try to address based on what the research shows is, for instance, people that are like have trait narcissism or are driven purely by ego, they get much more of a high out of performing in front of people where there is what are called opportunities for glory seeking. And then there's trait perfectionist people who, in training, they want to make sure everything is locked down and rigid. And they only want to go up on a weight if the attempt before it was perfect. However, in competition, the notion that they only get 3 attempts and the relevance and the goals that they set for the competition kind of put that perfectionism on the back burner and let them flourish a little more. So in both of those cases, I give coaches and athletes strategies that if your athlete is one of these dispositional traits that fall into these habits, here are ways you can get more out of them in training so that when they arrive at competition, they're even better prepared to take advantage of the fire they feel that day.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's definitely true. When you see someone go to competition, a big jump. That's always exciting as a coach, but you
Mm-hmm.
wonder, like, hey, if we can routinely hit 10 to 15 kilos more in competition, like, what if we were able to hit, you know, 5 to 10 more kilos on average in training, right? And it's
Yeah.
obviously there's that capability there. So how do we replicate some of that environment or mindsets or
Yeah.
whatever it is? Um, but it's difficult. I would much rather have that situation than the other, right? It's
Of
always
course.
like
Yeah.
it's always frustrating, not only for you but the lifter as well. If it feels like the peak isn't going good and the mindset's not good in the
Mm-hmm.
competition, because that always seems like you're struggling to figure those things out, right? Now, hopefully not after this book, but but no, it is a little bit more of a puzzle in terms of the competition prep, because no matter how good training is, you don't know what you're getting at the competition, and neither does the athlete. And it's more like their uncertainty grows as they have a lot of bad experiences, so it becomes harder and harder to, um, be like, hey, it's okay, we're going to have a great meet this
Mm-hmm.
time. So
Yep. Yeah. And the entire framework of the book hinges on exactly what you're talking about. And the understanding is how do we achieve peak performance, right? Which is what you're really talking about. You're like, I have this athlete, amazing in training. She's a training hall legend and underperforms on game day. So you can approach the question a little differently. You can say, all right, we know that there is such a thing as the physiology of peak performance. How do we get mindset skills to map on top of that so that they lead us towards that physiology rather than pulling us away from it. And that's a lot of what my book tries to explain through, to give you a short history, in 2009, Mark Jones, who's a researcher in England, he and his team published a now seminal article called A Theory of Challenge and Threat States in Athletes. Now, for purposes of psychology, the way they use theory is the same way that like an evolutionary biologist would use the word theory. What they really mean is a model or a framework for understanding, rather than say like some testable hypothesis. And since 2009, over 500 additional papers have looked at what the model suggests and have tested it. And a meta-analysis of 7,000 athletes has shown that athletes who can enter a challenge state, which is a distinct physiological state that leads to peak performance, athletes who can enter that challenge state perform better. So the question is, which mindset strategies get us to that physiology? And that's what the book explores. And the model itself suggests that there is an appraisal. The model builds on stress appraisal theory, which is the understanding that our reactions to a situation are more about us than they are about what the situation itself presents. So, in simplest terms, the model asks the question, if I'm about to take a snatching competition, how do I answer the question, do I believe that my personal resources meet or exceed the demands of the lift in front of me? And there are 3 qualities that, if developed properly, will help you answer yes every time.
Well, let's talk about them.
Okay, great. Let's talk about it. Yeah. So, again, this is a 2009 paper. They published a revised edition in 2020 in which they said, okay, we made a lot of predictions based on this model. And, again, 500 plus papers set out, other researchers set out to look at these predictions and test them. And so what they found were that the 3 resources that help an athlete, that if developed, help an athlete enter a challenge state on game day. The first is what's called self-efficacy, which is a very specific psychological quality that asserts that I believe that I can perform the task in front of me, whether it's a snatch or a clean or a jerk.
Mm-hmm.
The second resource is what's called control, which is my attention to those things, only those things over which I can influence the outcome of the event. So, for instance, rather than worrying about what the judges do or what your competitors do, or, some other coach just stole your clock, you focus exclusively on things directly under your control, such as your breathing, your tension, your rituals, how you use imagery and visualization, how you also, and this is probably the most important one that'll come up a little later, how you interpret the physiological signals your body is feeding you. For instance, take the case of anxiety. The very well studied phenomenon in sports psychology and in stress appraisal theory is anxiety is an interpretation of arousal. Now, everyone's experienced arousal before. Your heart starts running a little, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure rises a little bit, your attention seems to narrow, you might get sweaty palms, you might get an uneasy stomach, your legs might start feeling heavy. The athletes that interpret those signals in a manner that's facilitative, they actually derive physiological benefits from it. For instance, you take someone like Bill Russell, right? Or even, I'll use a more recent example who's talked about this. Josh Allen said, the quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, he said that he throws up before every single game. Now, that's quite a lot of vomiting during the course of a season. That's 17, games each season. And they usually make the playoffs with him. But even his teammates now, when they hear him throwing up in the bathroom, they get keyed up. They've learned to interpret it as positive as well, as productive. And so when they hear Josh Allen throwing up, they're like, all right, things are going to go well today. Josh is in the right frame of the right state. And then the third resource is the goals you set for yourself. Now, the literature refers to those as achievement goals, but we can look at them in two different ways. One of which would be approach goals, such as in the clean, I'm going to rack the bar aggressively. Or in the jerk, I'm going to punch the collars off the bar. These might be cues you've given your athletes and so forth. An avoidance goal, by contrast, would have you going out there thinking, oh man, I really need to stop leaving the bar out front in the snatches. Or I need to keep myself from rushing under. Or even more performance oriented. I need to, keep from letting my teammates down. You probably had athletes tell you all these things, right?
Yeah, just trying to frame it in that positive thing,
Yeah,
let's make my teammates proud instead of don't
that's
disappoint
right.
my teammates or something
Yeah,
like that. Like let me have
yeah.
a performance that will make my family proud or something like it. It makes all the difference in the way that you were able to frame it and put the lens on the situation.
And the most important part of that reframing is that it adjusts your physiology. And that's what's very interesting and very powerful about the theory of challenge and threat states is that athletes who arrive at game day with a high sense of self-efficacy, focused only on aspects over which they can exert control, and with goals aligned towards an approach motivation, such as rack it fast, keep your chest up, punch it into the ceiling. Those athletes experience or are more likely to experience that peak physiology that accompanies high performance in domains as diverse as sport, education, the military, medicine. And it's getting athletes to achieve that physiology through mindset techniques that is the real payoff of the book that I've put forth.
Yeah, so a lot of times, like say, I think when I'm nervous before a competition, I feel like I'm going to do better, right? And that's something that you
Yes.
mentioned. That's
Yeah.
that's like my interpretation of these feelings of nervousness and anxiety that
Mm-hmm.
present themselves. You've weighed in, you might have a little bit of a hard time eating because you're thinking about it, you care about it. And when you care about it and your body gets this adrenaline, you just know you're going to do good. Now that's how I frame it. But that has come about as a result of when I was younger, my coach like my original coach CJ Stockwell did a good job of making sure I went 6 for 6 my first 5, 6, 7
Yeah,
meets
of
before,
course.
and we still push ourselves, but we set ourselves up for that. The last attempt was the PR total, and so
Mm-hmm.
we kind of got there. So I had a good positive experience about competition. Now, these other folks who maybe come in and they maybe cut a little extra weight their first competition, went 2 for 6. I feel like it's really hard to override those natural interpretations. And so maybe we can give people one example of how you can override some of those interpretations that have been built up, because it's easy when you have an athlete who's
Sure.
succeeding and they're like, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm nervous. I know I'm going to do good." And I'll give
Absolutely.
I'll
Yeah.
give one more example for myself that's kind of funny is that every time that I had cut weight for competition when I was younger, I did well. I always had this perception. I was a wrestler, and so I'd be like, if I'm able to make weight from a higher weight, I'm gonna do good. And so I was having a really hard time making weight, and I had to cut like quite a bit of weight one time, and I remember like I had trash bags on me in the bathroom because I showed up to weigh in, and I was heavy, and I was like running around. I was still in that wrestling mindset, right? And so I was sweating, and I was just like chanting to myself, if I make weight, I'm gonna do so good at this meet. If I make, and then I remember like Zach Critch, if you remember him, he walks in
Absolutely.
and in his mind, he told me afterwards, he's like, yeah, like I definitely thought you were gonna do terrible. He's like, I
Yeah.
thought you were crazy for a champ, but it was a good meet for me.
Yeah.
at that competition. But it is true, the way that you naturally frame things goes a long ways. But if someone doesn't naturally frame things in a positive light, what are some strategies that they can use to kind of start doing that?
I'll give you your examples were great because they touched on two of the four sources that build self efficacy for an athlete. So number one is past mastery experiences, past times in competition when you did well. That's usually the go-to for many athletes. Is they say, okay, I've done well before in this situation, I can do well again. So they build that specific belief that I can rise and meet this challenge, or I can lift this bar today because it's gone for me this way in the past. The other one you touched upon, which was awesome, was our interpretations of our physiological signals. In your case, you said that when I feel a little bit nervous, I know it means I'm prepared. I know that it means my body is winding me up in a certain way, providing more energy, kind of like priming the nervous system for action. All of these things come from that appraisal, that reframing that you were taught how to do at a young age by a competent coach. Two other sources matter as well. The second is verbal persuasion. For instance, what your coach tells you or what your teammates say. Now, the great thing about these sources of self-efficacy is they operate through different pathways. If you feel supported by your coach or by your teammates, your body is going to release oxytocin and a hormone known as neuropeptide Y. So the theory of challenge and threat states also talks about these physiological processes. And oxytocin, great thing it does, it dampens down activity in the amygdala and redirects prefrontal control. So you reduce your fear and you gain a more kind of conscious control of the situation. Neuropeptide Y is a hormone associated with resilience under stress and with, say, courage under stress as well. And so having your teammates or your coach give you encouragement, whether it's even just a fist bump, these two things will also promote your self-efficacy through those same through similar physiological processes as your belief from past experiences. Now, in a situation like you mentioned, where an athlete, say, has had bad experiences in the past and they need to move past them, well, just like we started off with this conversation talking about, you develop a renewed form of self-efficacy in training. And that can take some work, but it is a developable and trainable skill. And a lot of it comes from how you reframe the value of each lift you take in training and competition. So, for instance, and I signify this in the book, so I'm okay with repeating it here. In my opinion, one of the biggest takeaways that I found from the research is that you have to view your made lifts in training and competition as productive or valuable or as forming a sense of your competence in order for them to count as a source of efficacy going forward. So, for instance, just to make this coaching athlete relatable, you've probably coached athletes who get done what you think is a great lift, and they find a way to pick it apart. Sure. I think, Phil Landers said it best when he said that this is the only sport where an athlete can go 6 for 6, PR everything, win, and still be unhappy about their performance. And I think a lot of athletes can relate to that. But the payoff is that unless you see those lifts as counting towards your ability, your brain stops storing them as evidence for future success. And that's when I read that, that's there's a woman at University of Michigan, Michigan State, one Want to avoid confusion. I
Don't
know
make that mistake.
that's the way they get very upset at me for conflating those two universities. A woman at Michigan State, Deborah Feltz. She is, one of the leading experts on this concept of self-efficacy in the country. And that understanding comes from a 2000 or 2001 paper of hers, called Self-Efficacy Beliefs in Coaches and Athletes. And it's a huge finding in my mind because we see that kind of counterproductive behavior in our sport fairly regularly, where again, an athlete gets done a good lift and they immediately find ways to just start picking it apart. So to kind of bring this full circle is you're going to have to change the way you talk to yourself. You're going to have to change the way you evaluate or appraise success in training. And so I have, I think 2 chapters in the book touch on that directly, and a third one mentions it a part of building a different sort of understanding of mindset. But you're going to have to decide in advance what counts as a win for you in training from day to day. And the number one recommendation that I can say from the literature is each training day, judge the success of that session by the best executed lift you've made. Rather than thinking about, but I smoked 90%, but then I missed 93% 8 times. Get over it. That's an unproductive hang-up. You need to instead move past it. You need to start finding ways to build a sense of self-efficacy, to start seeing yourself as a productive weightlifter and taking yourself seriously enough to do it day in and day out. The second way in which I talk about this is that it's important to see that one of the big benefits of training, the way that weightlifters do it especially, is that a lot of us we move from very general approaches post-competition to very specific as the competition nears. And you need to see yourself as accumulating successes over the course of that long training block. So for instance, you might, and even in the case of an injury, like in the chapter where I talk about how to reverse a downward spiral before a competition, which a lot of lifters experience, and it's okay that they do, and they need strategies to get out of it. But if you can see that you've developed weightlifting specific skills and qualities through every training session, you're going to show up on game day in a much different place regarding your belief in your capacities as a weightlifter.
Yeah, I think so this is a little different, but one of the things that I know is that on a banner painted on top of your gym is today is an important day.
Yeah.
And so it sort of is like this lift is an important lift,
Yes.
And I mean, even days, it's like the narrative that you create in your mind about your journey through this training program. Like when you get to the competition, you may not feel 100% peaked out. So, the goal as a coach or an athlete is to structure your training so you feel the best on competition day. That's like the goal. It doesn't always happen that way, right? It could be because of life stress or something else, but it just doesn't always materialize. So, I mean, even those days when you feel crappy and you have to battle and you kind of feel like it's a lost day, it's really preparing you for if the peak doesn't go 100% properly, you can still fight and make heavy weights.
That's right.
It's just not as fun. It doesn't feel as good, but you can still do it.
Yeah.
So,
or maybe you could even lean into some of the more, what we would consider negative aspects of that. Like if you're feeling like crap, that's an opportunity for you to show up even more.
mm-hmm.
A lot of the research talks about how, like, the manner in which you appraise your physiological readiness is going to actually determine how your physiology responds. The classic case of, like, for instance, with anxiety, the research is very clear. If you see it as facilitating performance, it will benefit you. For instance, people that are anxious, they're often great about how well they lean into their routines, how well they structure their preparation going into a competition. Those are real assets. Like, and you know this, you coach athletes who are kind of show up a little half-heartedly each day, or they just, oh well, today is just a 70% day. I'm just going to kind of go through it. And then you get a person who's like completely locked in because they've learned how to harness their competitive anxiety. And so every day they show up, they prepare well. And then when they get the competition, they can say, all right, well, here's how I want this to feel. Here's how I want to feel. Here's how I want to breathe. Here's how I want to set up with the bar. Here are the kind of emotions I want to help create within my own mind, whether that's through music or imagery or visualization or by talking with my coach. And then that anxiety, which causes some people to spiral, now gives them a very narrow channel through which they can push that excess physiological energy that the game day gives them.
Yeah, I think uh, one of the things that you stated is like understanding that each training session matters, and
Mm-hmm.
I think like when you're able to understand like, hey, I hit X number of lifts at 120 kilos when my max is 150 kilos. I'm just using like random round
Sure,
numbers,
of
but
course.
um, like 120 kilos compared to 150, that's 80%, right? And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's not exciting for the lifter. It doesn't feel good, but that's like that's like your key weight, really, like between 80
Yeah,
and 85%. That's where
yeah.
most of your reps and technique are built. And kind of like if you're able to understand in context, like, hey, I did X number of reps above 120 last training cycle, but I actually did that many reps above 125, or, you don't have to get so into the nitty gritty, but if you have some basic metrics, like, hey, I hit
Yep.
140 8 times this training block, but I only hit it 6 times the last training block, even though I had one outlier day that's felt better last training block. I might actually be better leading into the competition. I just
Yeah.
haven't expressed it yet. But really, all that matters is if I express it or not in the competition. So I'm okay because I'm more consistent at 87%, 92%.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, that's always try to play brain games with myself to say, hey, like, yes, I didn't hit a PR, but like I can tell that compared to last training cycle, I am chipping away, right? I'm hitting heavier percentages.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and you've actually, I mean, I read an article that you wrote for Catalyst a long time ago, where you talked about the way in which an athlete can understand progress that is unrelated to, like, say, improvements in the PR. And one of the things that I remember you mentioning was, well, you raise the floor. That's a widely used term now in performance psychology. Is each day you set higher minimum standard, not each day, but each block you set a slightly higher minimum standard for yourself to hit each session. And that again is a great way to build that sense of competence that fuels self-efficacy in competition, that leads you to more strongly state, whether consciously or otherwise, I believe I can make this lift. And it's a very distinct concept from, say, confidence, which is more of a generalized emotion or feeling that I'm going to do well today, or, oh, I believe I can succeed. This concept of self-efficacy, I'm going to take a detour really quick, but the concept of self-efficacy is always tied to a task. For instance, take a surgeon. I believe I can perform this operation in 4 hours before this organ that I'm trying to transplant loses its vitality. Right. Very specific belief in that case. And to this end, USA Weightlifting sent an email out from a researcher at Michigan State who probably works with Deborah Feltz, saying that they want a lot of volunteers to help study self-efficacy in weightlifting specifically. This is, and you're right, you build these resources at training weights, I would argue more likely around 70 to 85%. Because you know this, if you show up and say, I'll just use a personal example. I came in when I was still training and competing at the national level. I came into training one day after a big fight with a family member. and I'm warming up. And around the time I was routinely snatching 120-ish or so, and I'm warming up, and I make 50, I make 60, I put 70 on the bar, and I miss it behind. Barely even, what is that, 12 times 6? Barely 60%. And I'm missing because I'm distracted, because all of my musculature is tight, because my breathing is off. And if I had gone up to 70%, I would have probably continued missing. A lot of things has to go right in the movements, the snatch, the clean, the jerk, for successful lifts at 70% to happen at all, even with a very strong athlete. So I encourage my lifters to start building that sense of ability for competition in that weight range specifically.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Let me ask you a question that's a little different, but so
Sure.
like Roger Bannister, the guy who ran the
Yeah.
first 4 minute mile. So there's
Mm-hmm.
the Bannister effect, and so obviously people are capable of more than they think, because when you've been in the sport a long time, I feel like it's almost like a detriment to me to have been in the sport so long, because I've seen so many people come into weightlifting
Mm-hmm.
that I have this natural lens that I'm looking at based on history. You make like your ideas of what is possible based on what you've seen and experienced.
Sure.
And so, oftentimes people who make huge progress are outsiders who come in and aren't limited by so much of this, history. Um, so how
That's,
can you
that's, that's actually a really, really good assessment.
now?
Yeah.
I would say in women's weightlifting, for instance, in the U.S., take like Jenny Arthur. I would say she was probably the first. Like there might be an effect from people seeing her, and then now all the way up to
Mm-hmm.
Olivia Reeves. Um, like as someone who's been in the sport a while, what strategies can you do to forget some of the history and just focus on what is really possible? Because like as soon as he ran the 4 minute mile, tons of people did. As soon as
Yeah.
Ginny started snatching 100,
Yep.
and somebody might have done it before, but then you had, I would miss somebody if I named them off, but Maddie, etc., all the way up, Kate, and now
Yeah.
Olivia and Meredith and all those other people. And now it's like 100 kilos is as crazy as it sounds, like nothing.
Well, I
But
think I think 100 is the old 90.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah,
Yep.
not nothing. It's very significant, but like, I mean, you have so many non-supers. You used to have some super
Mm-hmm.
heavyweights like Cheryl and Sarah who were snatching 100, but it was like, okay, they're supers, but we didn't have
Yeah.
any 63s, 69s.
Yeah.
We got like Sophie Schaff snatching like 103 at 63 kilos at a
I
young
I
age, and
think Danielle Gunnan snatched 100 at 58.
yeah, yeah,
That first time
absolutely.
she cut. Yeah. And so this is great because what you're touching on now is the one source of self-efficacy that I've yet to mention, which is vicarious experience. And it's, again, exactly what you mentioned, whether you want to call it the Jenny Arthur effect or the Maddie effect. It's adjusting your belief about your own competence based upon what you see other people do. Now, in terms of learning, we understand this best because we all know that you can watch a video of, say, a technical model, and you can modify your technique based upon what you see. Correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So the same type of process occurs when you see someone do what you like you suggest, what Roger Bannister does. And I think that again, it's in my book, I outline 3 specific ways to approach this problem, 2 of which are the use of video. How to use videos for technical modeling that improves your own competence in both training and competition, and then how to use videos for motor learning of patterns that also improves your own sense of confidence. So the one you're touching upon is like when you see a teammate make a lift that you thought was outside your boundaries, and then you reconsider and you say, "Oh, all right, I could do that too." And very similar to how with Roger Bannister, you're right to acknowledge that. I think it was like 4 or 5 other runners were chipping away at that, 401 point whatever marker, and then he does it, and then within 3 months or so, many other people do it. So I try to encourage the lifters I coach to, hmm, it's interesting. It involves both goals and motivation. And it's also, again, whether you're going to set self-limiting beliefs on yourself. And I'll give you a very concrete example of that in both directions, one productive, one unproductive. So I coached a lifter at one point who would routinely say to myself or teammates, I have to make a good clean in order to make a good jerk. You've probably coached somebody who had a similar kind of self-limiting belief.
Mm-hmm.
Right. All right. So is that belief true or false? Or is
Well,
it or is it predictive?
it's predictive, but not necessarily true or false. Like more times than not, you're gonna give yourself a better chance, but you can make a jerk after a bad clean.
Of course you can. Yeah, but right or wrong. So
Yeah.
the model within cognitive behavioral psychology is that your beliefs produce thoughts and emotions rather than the other way around. Your thoughts and emotions may add more evidence to that belief as you confirm it through practice. Like, for instance, if you stand up a rough clean and 9 times out of 10 you miss the jerk,
Mm-hmm.
the way you think about that is going to affect you. It's going to affect how your body devotes resources towards your physiology on the next heavy attempt. Because the person who holds that belief genuinely, if they stand up a rough clean, we all know what kinds of emotions they're going to experience, whether that's panic or a little bit of terror or, maybe self-doubt. And those are characteristics of a threat physiology, which leads to dampened performance and execution. Now, I'll give you the productive example. I also coached a lifter who said to me, when you gave me a clean plus 2 jerks before that one meet, that really helped me because it made me think that whatever I could clean and double jerk, I could open within competition. And so we kept that metric going for quite a long time. And it always produced that beneficial effect. And so what kind of emotions and thoughts does that produce? Well, when he opens, as long as he makes the clean, he's going to stick that jerk. He knows he can make it. In terms of, but it has a number of other physiological payoffs as well. That opening clean and jerk now costs him very little in terms of both physiological and psychological resources. And why is that? Is that because the belief is true or false? Right.
Yep.
So I would say that those Maddie effect beliefs would operate in the same fashion. If you hold yourself to a certain standard, within some contexts, for instance, Bob Rotella, who wrote How Champions Think, he refers to this as an internal thermostat. If your belief about yourself is that you can do 100 and 125, the moment you hit 100 and 125, you're going to have to really fight hard to get past that.
Mm-hmm.
Because you've set your internal thermostat a certain way. So what I do instead is I encourage athletes to set way more open-ended goals that focus on something way different than numbers. Now, everybody has these goals, and they're fine to have. Like, for instance, a female joins the club and she wants to hit a bodyweight snatch, then she wants to hit 110% body weight, or a male athlete wants to snatch 100 and then 120, because they all want to get like that, those 2 reds on the bar.
Mm-hmm.
But I try to encourage people to see each of those as a rung in a ladder rather than some desired endpoint to rise up toward. And sometimes it's hard because sometimes you get a kid who comes in and his internal thermostat is set real low. And he thinks, oh, if I can just make 100, I can just make 100 kilo clean and jerk, I'll finally feel good about myself. And that's rough, but we've all, as coaches, we've all experienced those athletes. And athletes listening to this are probably going to say, oh, I think that way. And it's possible that some do. But in terms of building the psychological qualities that matter, such as self-efficacy, the best thing you can do is exactly what happened with Roger Bannister. You see someone else's performance as proof of general ability. If
Yeah,
he
I
can
mean, it's
do
like
it, I can too.
if them, why not me?
Right.
I think I talk to a lot of people like newer weightlifters, and sometimes they put like I feel like I'm able to accurately say like person X is better than me, person Y is a little less than me.
Hmm.
Person Y can catch me, I can catch person above me. Like there's a reason why someone is doing more than me or less than me, and it's not necessarily innate ability, right?
Sure.
There's maybe some of that, but you can overcome a lot of that, and so I think a lot of people don't necessarily see it that way, and I mean I guess that comes to like growth mindset versus fixed mindset to a certain
Yeah.
extent, but they believe that they can grow, so it's not that they completely have a fixed mindset, but they just put other people on a pedestal, and it kind of comes with like any skill. But I see it in weightlifting a lot where people who have a lot of talent, but it's not developed yet because they're only in 2-3 years into
Yep.
training, and you see Maddie or Olivia, and take Maddie because she's been at it longer. Like she's been doing this for I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years now. Um, and like what's the difference between you and Maddie? If you're talking to a female lifter who you feel like has potential to do that, it's like, well, she's been doing this a lot longer. She puts in a lot of time and grit into this, and so you can't really expect to have that result in a short amount of time.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. I just naturally always felt like, hey, like yeah, I'm an underdog, and Kendrick Ferris is doing huge weights, but that's possible, and you
Yeah.
may not ever reach those people. There's always going to be outliers, and only one person can be the best. But I think I've never had this mindset that like what someone else was doing was not possible for me.
Mm.
I don't know how to program that to someone who doesn't naturally think that way, aside from just having conversations and trying to expose them to that idea, though.
Well, it's interesting that you bring all this up because the my book can function in multiple ways, and one
Mm-hmm.
is to give athletes a roadmap for how to approach common scenarios within the sport. For instance, how to reverse the downward spiral before a meet. That's a chapter in the competition section. Another one is how to return from injury. Because your beliefs and your mindset about the injury absolutely affects how well you're going to recover from it. And
Now,
then,
can I
go
stop
ahead.
there for a second? So I think
Sure.
injury is a really cool spot to talk through, because I think it's easy to view things as a challenge and not a threat
Yeah,
before you experience an injury.
of course.
And
Yes, you're
and
right.
then like I had a knee issue for a little bit that I've been working through, and you have pains and aches and small injuries along the way, and hopefully they aren't too big, but some people experience really big injuries. And let's kind of dig into that a little bit, like how to not view heavy weights as a threat that have injured you in the past, because
Mm.
that's probably a very tough one, I would imagine, to overcome.
Yeah, I would imagine too. And I would think so. The example I use in my book is Lee Wen, who, she injured her elbow and had to withdraw from, I believe it was the 2023 World Championships. And then she had to withdraw again from the 2024 Asian Games. And then she showed up at the Olympics and won anyway. And she talked about it in interviews that I incorporated some of into the book. And the strategies you're going to have to, again, the whole theory of challenge and threat is based upon stress appraisal, or how you frame stress, or in movements where you feel less capable, how you reframe the situation to either minimize the demands of the situation or maximize your perception of personal resources. And so in these cases, how you view the injuries matters a lot. And there's a lot of research. There was one of the primary sources that I used for these couple chapters on injury and then return to sport was there was a 50-year study on the psychology of returning from injury in sport. And sorry, by 50 years, I mean they tracked the results of studies over the past half century. And for instance, the number one thing that stood out to me was that athletes who took an unrealistic approach to their ability to come back from the injury succeeded far better than those people who either took a neutral or a pessimistic approach. And this was seen across multiple domains, including things like heart surgery, and in addition to like sports injury and so forth. So that's one example of what the book offers in terms of providing people with actionable steps that they can take. And with return to injury, without giving too much of it away, I think you'll understand this as somebody who has been a high level athlete. And I've had to say this to a couple lifters of mine as they return from injury, is that we compete in one of the safest Olympic sports. That's documented. The injury incidence in our sport is among the lowest in all Olympic sports, whereas something like soccer is among the highest, for example. And we know intuitively that the lifts are safest when they're performed with speed, to say prevent a bar crash, insistence to lock the bar out securely overhead, and at times a little bit of aggression to provide the necessary acceleration. Trying to get yourself back to where you were before an injury means actively trying to embrace those positive qualities that got you successes that you had earned before. So when you return, and again, I'll give you another example of how, if the way you use your time post-injury is going to affect how you return. If you can see the injury as providing utility of some sort, like for instance, Li Wen was very clear in the interviews. She said, "We always knew there was something off about my snatch technique. This injury forced me to finally address it." I think Don McCauley had something that he used to say that you would have more first-hand experience with. He said the barbell punishes bad movements.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that understanding, too, that if you can find a way to view your return, to reframe it productively, you're going to build a better mindset coming back than maybe even the one you had going into the injury before. And you see this in a lot of sports athletes. The one I remember most from childhood is John Elway having to get Tommy John surgery on his elbow. He said, "Well, they had to make a shorter version of the tendon for me, so that just means that my ball speed's going to increase," when he threw. And it did, and he went on to win 2 Super Bowls after having that surgery. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of what you're talking about is that challenge versus threat, and I just think when things are going well, it's easy to be like, this is a challenge. You have that young lifter that's eager. They like to go heavy a lot. They're attacking weights,
Yep.
and they sustain their first injury, and then they come back and things are seemingly going well again, and then they have a relapse and maybe don't get injured, but they kind of feel, that didn't feel good. And kind of getting through that is a really pivotal point because everyone's going to experience, hopefully you don't experience any major injuries, but you're going to experience pains and frustrations along the way and overuse injuries and all that
Yep.
kind of stuff. It's just totally natural. And you have to be able to understand, when to stop and when to keep going and be able to frame it in a certain way where if you should stop, you have to be able to convince yourself that you've done enough training to get better.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's so much. I like that. You're saying that your narrative that you create. You didn't use these words, but my
Sure.
interpretation is like the narrative that you create about your own journey determines like how well the training is actually gonna affect you.
I would
So
100% agree with that statement because it's all about how you appraise each situation in which you find yourself. One of the chapters in my book is called "Building Mental Toughness, One Missed Rep at a Time." And I used to think it's interesting. I used to think that our sport was very similar to baseball, whereas baseball is a sport of misses, right? Even the best batters, they strike out 6.5 times out of 10, or they, get on base only half the time at best. Like an on base percentage of 500 is extraordinary, and it occasionally happens. I now think that the missed lifts all provide value, and one of the chief ways in which they provide value is that they enable you, and this is without getting too much into the history of the sports psychology, the whole concept of self-efficacy was developed and constructed by a psychologist at Stanford in the 70s, Albert Bandura. And he, in later writings, 30 years later, he also coined a different term called resilient self-efficacy. And it's this notion that each time I miss a lift and show myself by making an adjustment, realigning my focus, and then approaching the bar with an adjustment-oriented mindset, and I make the lift, I encode a mastery experience and build self-efficacy in as if I had made it the first time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But over time, the big benefit you get out of missing, whether it's controlling, like reestablishing your approach to the next rep and then making it, is that you build mental toughness as well. And so yes, I agree with you. It's like coming back from an injury. I think the worst injury I sustained was I tore an abductor, and I tore my rectus abdominis in the same moment. I missed a split jerk where my back leg slid across the platform, and it just tore both of those muscles. That took like 6 months, but the whole time I was eager to just get back into the gym. And there's a lot of research that talks about how an athlete tying their identity to their sport can be counterproductive. But that 50-year study suggested that one of the best ways to return from injury is to reestablish what's called relatedness, which is reconnecting your sense of self to the sport in which you've already put so much time. And that means, like, if you want to come back from injury solidly, get back to the gym, even if it means you're just there watching other people train, or using an empty bar, or going in there to do your prehab, or just going in there to re-engage your sense of community. So a lot of these things are adjacent to, like, say, direct mindset interventions, like, say, breathing, or arousing emotions, or harnessing and summoning courage. But they all, again, in terms of my book, they all map onto what a lifter might experience during her career, and showing you how, in each of these situations, you can find a productive way to assess what's happening and benefit from it.
Let me ask you one other one that's a little different. So I've been lifting for like 21 years, and other people that have, like Phil Sabatini, for instance.
Yeah.
I think there are periods of time where you have to do stuff outside of weightlifting, whether it's like finish college, you have to do something important thing at work, you decide that you're going to have kids, and the first 6 months is absolutely crazy, and you kind of have to accept in advance that this is not probably the time you're going to go and hit PRs and do things. I think a lot of people have like this all or nothing mindset, and you have to, if you're going to do something for a long time, say, hey, if I can only get two good training sessions this week, that is okay.
Yeah.
And that's still productive, because if I did nothing, I'm detraining completely. Whereas I can maybe maintain on 2 to 3 training sessions a week. And how do you encourage people to not be all or nothing? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm either training
Yes.
full time 9 times a week, or I'm
Yeah.
not training at all.
Well, I'll tie it in with a story from somebody who you and I both know really well, Peter Rosselli. And I remember when I was just getting going as a coach, I showed up at a university. I think it was either University of Nationals or Arnold, and I had a young lifter with me. It was an athlete. We were running a weightlifting club at Bryn Mawr College, and we'd had a couple of the lifters from there qualify for, I think it was either the universities or the Arnold. And I thought this one had a lot of promise, and I wanted to introduce her to Pete, who I think at the time was still the high performance director for USA Weightlifting. And he asked her how old she was, how long she'd been in the sport. And then, to my complete surprise, he asked her two questions. He said, "Are you married?" And she was like, "No." And then he said, "Do you own a house?" And she was like, "No, I live in the dorms." And he's like, "Good. Keep it that way and you'll succeed."
What?
I thought it was really out of pocket. And I think about embarrassing Pete by saying that. It touches directly on what you're saying. Is that, yes, sometimes life is going to interfere with your greater goals in sport. And in those moments, you're going to have to do some of the things I mentioned earlier, which you've acknowledged in previous things you've written as well, is you're going to have to decide what counts as a win.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think, and I one of the examples from my book that really I try to share with athletes as often as I can is I remember it was maybe 2020 or 2021, Sarah Davies, who competed for the UK at the Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
She hit, I think it was like 100 or 101 for a snatch double. And she said, "Oh my God, it's taken me 2 years to put 1 kilo on my best snatch double." And a lot of people at the gym were talking about it. And I said to each of them, I said, "Okay, so do you think that she viewed those 730 training sessions as unproductive in that 2-year buildup?" We all know the answer. She went to the Olympics. Of course, she had a different mindset about it. And so that's what I do to get the athletes away from an all or nothing thinking. And it's difficult with some because some people, sometimes I would argue that, when you set like a very short timeline for your goals, it's really a reflection of something deeper like fear of failure.
Mm-hmm.
So getting the athlete out of that space has a little more to do with where they're coming from. Why is it that they see, like, for instance, I had a kid who said to me, he had a meet coming up in like 8 weeks. And he said, "You know what? Unless I qualify for senior nationals at this meet," which was a realistic goal. He said, "Unless I qualify for senior nationals at this meet, I'm quitting." And I was like, all right, how do you think that expectation is going to shape the next 8 weeks of your training? And I got him to change his approach because inadvertently what he was doing was, with putting that much pressure on himself to achieve that goal on such a very time-bounded, end, it was adding weight to every heavy attempt in the gym.
Yeah, just putting pressure on every heavy day. So if he didn't feel good, he was like, it's like a foregone conclusion, like as these bad days stack up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can see how that might go one way or the other, right? I can see how someone with a certain personality could usually like use that fuel and have that deadline and like, hey, it's time to rock and roll. But it probably in most situations is unhealthy to think that way.
Yeah. Yeah, well, again, you're right. A lot of it is dispositional. It's, how are you wired? And then the process is, how can we use how you're wired to get you to achieve success? So beyond the scope of the book, there's a few appendices that I include, and one of them addresses that to a degree. And it says, look, each of us comes to the training hall with certain personality traits, whether it's anxiety, like trait anxiety, or trait optimism, or, another one might be trait narcissism, trait perfectionism. How can we turn each of these into leverage that you can actively manipulate in your favor? And I do think that appendix itself might grow into like its own separate text, but I wanted to demonstrate to the readers and to coaches reading the book that however you're built, this model of challenge and threat can help you find ways to leverage it to make better appraisals of the situations in which you find yourself. So, for instance, a trait optimistic person usually perceives that their resources will meet the demands of the situation. Well, that's usually a virtue. Where it becomes a problem is if they become cocky, or they start skipping training sessions, or they slack off on their accessories. Someone like a trait, someone with, like, say, trait neuroticism, on the other hand, they want to just lock down every detail. Well, you show them how that can enhance a sense of control.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, each of these, ones we normally think of as beneficial versus ones that we normally think of as, say, adversarial towards goals. And again, the classic example of this might be like a tax attorney who has OCD. He's going to do a great job preparing tax returns or going through the legal issues around them. The same thing applies to weightlifters. An athlete who wants to make sure that every little detail is locked down on game day is going to be able to lean into like their rituals better, lean into their processes better. And part of the ways you can help them in that regard, from what the research shows and what the model of challenge and threat shows, is, all right, you have to segment out the cues they're focusing on. You have to make them very specific. You have to have them see their approach goals for the lift as concise, as something that's very specific and actionable, towards which they can leverage that inherent trait that they bring to the situation.
What do you think about visualization and the way that you see yourself? And I was just kind of thinking about this randomly, like since AI has gotten so good,
Yeah.
maybe you could create AI of yourself doing a few kilos more than you usually do in competition, and like kind of use that to reframe your mind. I don't know. Just throwing things out there.
I'll give you one real life example from someone other than me. So in his book, How Champions Think, Bob Rotella talks about how Shaquille O'Neal, of all people, came to him and said, "Hey, listen, I need to improve my ability to make three pointers in a game." You know, and one of the ways in which Rotella solved it or helped him was he said, "Hey, listen, I'm going to have you create a highlight reel of all the three pointers you've ever made, and I want you to watch it before games and at halftime. And while you're watching it, I want you to associate where you are with what you felt when you made each of those buckets." So in that sense, visualization, yes, 100% could accurately help. And with AI, yeah, I think I know less about it than you might.
Yeah, I think we're a ways away from being able
Yeah.
to put a video of yourself snatching 145 and say, hey, make this 155 and make it look accurate.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be kind of like if it was realistic, obviously if you're like, oh, put a video of me who's someone who typically snatches 140, 145 with like a 175, that becomes like it's hard for me to make that leap, right? Like
Sure.
that's too
Yeah.
much for it to be realistic. But if it's like, okay, 150, 152, 155, you can start to make that leap there, that incremental
Yeah.
leap.
Well,
Do you,
the research on goal setting would explain that. Your immediate goals have got to be very high resolution and
mm-hmm.
within a within a realm of possible short-term achievement. So you're right. I mean, it would be a massive leap for you to go from like 145 to
Yeah, of
175.
course.
Yeah.
And so even if you were to create something like it's not really realistic, so I'm not able to actually improve my mental state
Mm-hmm.
and ability to change the way my perception of myself. But if it's close enough, Now, if someone has like these long-term goals and then they kind of map it out and say, hey, at the next competition, in order to stay on track, I need to be at this weight, and maybe they miss it by a couple kilos, but they still have a good performance. Um, how do we keep them um, in a frame of mind that that was still a great performance? Like, hey, you know,
Well,
you've made progress.
you're a coach. I think you understand this, that an active debriefing process is going to help the most.
Mm-hmm.
How do you talk to them? How do you get them to see their performance after the meet? And there's, again, because I tried to make this book a map of what athletes are going to go through over the course of their time in the sport, there's a chapter on how coaches and athletes together can structure the debrief in a way that maximizes their perception of what happened and the resources that they're going to take out of it. So again, just going back to that Deborah Feltz article that I mentioned earlier as we talked, you have to view your successes, your made lifts in a productive fashion in order for your brain to store them as evidence for future attempts. So the debrief is going to matter. You've got to get the athlete to understand that, okay, for instance, if they say they got rushed on their attempt from 2 to 3 on the clean and jerk because the coach stole a clock or something, and all they did was make the clean. And I should say that with my hand quotes up, because all they did is actually a big deal. You know what it's like to try and attempt a clean double, basically, at 98%. It's very hard. And if they made the clean, you've got to have them reflect on that in the debrief process in a way that's going to encourage future self-efficacy, future self-belief. So you have to say, all right, look, you made that second clean at 98% with 30 seconds of rest, and you still smoked it when you stood up. You'll have more for the jerk next time. But that lift shows you, that second attempt on fatigue shows you what you can do when you have to rise to meet that moment.
Yeah, and when in the debriefing process, so obviously emotions are running high right after the competition. That's not the time to do it, but do you recommend like you travel back home and when you get back in the gym, or if you're working remotely, you have a Zoom call at that point once you're thinking more logically?
I'll walk you through the first of the couple steps that the book highlights and explains. Step number one is that, yes, there is a moment where a hot take is going to be counterproductive. The emotions are running high. And in those situations, without any judgment, without too much feedback, if the athlete has something they want to say, let them say it. And to athletes, so again, the book is addressed to coaches and athletes. For athletes, sometimes it's going to help you to just get everything down on paper right after a meet, because you're taking that emotional energy out of your body and putting it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And so I recommend probably, let the athlete cool off a little bit, but definitely set aside a structured time. Hey, listen, when you come in on Tuesday after the meet you had on Saturday, we can sit down and talk about what we're going to carry forward from that competition.
Mm-hmm. Now, last question.
Sure.
That I have. How do you, in your coaching, balance what you believe is most physiologically correct to give your athletes, while also keeping in mind the psychological aspect? Because I'm assuming by writing this book, you think that the psychological components of training are as important, if not more important. So
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry, Travis.
Yeah. So just basically in simple terms, like, what do you feel like one is more important than the other when it comes to programming, or is it just this balance of all of it and making sure that you're talking to the athlete and making sure that they're on board with certain things?
Yeah, I'll explain it to you in terms of talking to athletes. All right, so one of the quickest way to get into a threat's physiology is for the athlete to go out there thinking of things that they want to avoid doing. Because you're activating like error detection systems within the brain, and The research supports that if you're focused on an error, you're actually increasing the likelihood of the error happening. So here's one practice that I started adopting in the gym over the past couple of years is I've stopped until the session's over. I've stopped telling the athlete, even if they ask, what did I do wrong? Instead, I only tell them what is the forward facing adjustment that will help them the most on the next lift to get them to focus on it. So within, the physiological model of challenge and threat, your approach goals matter in terms of activating how much and the degree of which you put physiological qualities such as and emotional qualities into what you're trying to perform. Like, for instance, if you're feeling really excited, but your goal is to go out and stop yourself from leaving out front, that excitement will be wasted on that attempt. But if you're harnessing it and you're saying, oh man, I feel great for this, I really want to get after it, and your approach goal is rip it to your chin in the snatch, for instance, that's where the energy is going to get directed. So I started in training, in competition, I definitely keep myself from talking about errors. In training, I only give them something actionable that's an adjustment to what they can perform on the next rep. And I think, learning who your athletes are and meeting them at where they are, or even a little bit beyond that, is helpful in this regard, because there are some athletes who approach weightlifting from a very cognitive perspective. And being a smart person yourself, I imagine you might have been one of those. And they want to understand, like, okay, how does, you wanted me to do this differently on the next rep, but I want to know, like, what caused it to happen in the first place. I save all that for after the session, when they're less charged, both emotionally and physiologically, and only to the extent that it might help them improve, like, say, their kinesthetic awareness or their sense of, what they want to work on going forward.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I think like one of the strategies that like, say for instance, if I have a workout that I could write this, like, hey, I want you to work up and hit 85% for 5 singles.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's what we should be doing this far out from me. Or you could just, do a little chutes and ladders, like add 5 kilos each rep, and then if you miss, you got to take off 10 kilos. Like I guess that would be the difference in, like, okay, this is like a physiological workout, like where I feel like, okay, in our training plan, if we hit 85% for 5 reps, that's ideal, quote unquote. But then the chutes and ladders is fun and gets the result from the lifter.
Yeah, absolutely.
So kind of like walking that line is challenging. I guess that's the art form in coaching, right?
Yes.
It's like understanding some form of theory, or at least creating a basis of your training program and plan, but also trying to flip the switches of the mind of the athlete when they're feeling down and need that gamification. Yeah, it's always tricky, right?
Yeah. And
But
it probably, now that you've been both a high level athlete and coach, it probably gives you a wider, more open perspective for everything that happens in an athlete's life.
yeah, 100%. And
Yeah.
one of the things that you have to learn that I think is very difficult for athletes, and that's why some athletes transition to coaching and some don't, is that things that you did naturally well aren't always the things that your athletes do naturally, oftentimes not. And
Yeah.
so
Of course.
probably the things that you sucked at naturally are the things you're going to be a better coach at most of the time, because you actually had to understand those parts of the lift and those struggles, which is counterintuitive because everybody's like, oh, so and so is a good clean and jerker. I want to work with them and learn how they clean and jerk. And then they're just
Mm-hmm.
basically like, so and so is a good squatter. What did you do? Well, I stood the weight up.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I used my naturally gifted levers and stood the weight up.
but
Yeah.
if somebody was a hard gainer on squat but got better at it over the long haul, they might
Hmm.
understand like, hey, like I really started tracking my reps and I progressively overloaded at this rate, or whatever. They might understand it on a deeper level or have like more deep thought behind it. And people don't always think like you, right? So when we're talking about
Yeah.
these ideas that have been presented in your book and our discussion today, like if you don't struggle in these areas, you don't have ways to overcome them because
Mm.
you just naturally had those traits. Um, and sometimes that's hard, when you see someone who doesn't really view themselves as um, having the ability to get to certain weights, but you can tell that they're physically capable. That
Hmm.
that can be frustrating because if you didn't it's hard to understand. And also someone who's talented who doesn't care about the sport, like you can't force someone to love the things that you love,
Yeah.
and it's really confusing because you're like, why does
Yeah.
you got like I mean, to use an example that like of an athlete like Harrison Morris, right? Like extremely talented, goes to the Olympics, gets fourth place, and to me, I'm like, man, like I've trained my whole life to be what he just did, and he's right there, and decides that weightlifting is not for him, and that's very very interesting, right? Like if
Yeah.
you were his coach, you're like supportive, but it's a little bit like, why don't you love weightlifting like
uh,
other people do? It's
yeah.
yeah. So
Well,
um,
I think that, to give you a little nod, and I mentioned this earlier before we started that I would bring it back to this, is I use you as a very good example within the book. I talk about your career a little bit. I talk about Lydia Valentin in the same way. And the way I reference it is that Paris Dimas, we were at LSUS for a youth camp, youth and junior camp. I think it was summer of 2022.
mhm.
And Dimas told a story to the group because, I think they had scheduled him to talk to the athletes about certain topics. And he said that he cleaned 215 for the first time in 1992. And he clean and jerked it for the first time in competition in 2000.
Mm.
8 years for 5 kilograms. That requires a lot of what I signal you as a good example of, which is mental endurance, the quality of just being able to continually persist while also silencing that inner voice that might unfortunately say, hey, getting pretty far away from your goals. Hey, you're getting older. Hey, would you like to spend more time with your wife and kids? And it's that kind of it transcends commitment because you understand this. I mean, without having been in the room uh, at at Muscle Driver, did the room have any windows or natural lighting?
Not a whole lot, no.
Yeah. Yes, there are lots of times like those 8 years that Dimas spent chasing those 5 kilograms. That might have been in a room without any natural light, with the same group of guys, the same coach, the same daily routine, day after day after day. And this is something far different from me. You know, again, saying that Harrison Morris lacked that quality, but he chose a different priority. He wanted to go to medical school, and but the willingness to continue to subject yourself to something that is very discipline oriented and very process oriented, and which provides, what do we compete once every 3 or 4 months?
If that, yeah. So
Combines something that provides very few immediate tangible rewards. That's, for some people, developing that quality or bringing it to the table is going to make the difference.
Yeah, and there's absolutely a million things that you can do with your life, and so many of
Yeah,
them are
of course. Yeah.
worthwhile. So there's
Yeah.
definitely nothing bad about choosing a different path. It just when you're someone who's very into something, and you want to stay around it for the long term and have, sometimes that can be like, man, like if I was in that situation, I would be like doubling down and tripling
Yeah.
down on
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but yeah, anyways, yeah, good talk, Jim. I appreciate you coming on. Yeah, maybe in the future we can have another episode, sort of incorporating these concepts, but talking about some of the other stuff related to coaching and um, you know, some of the athletes and things that current events, maybe there's a world championship or something and we can kind of debrief on that a little bit. So,
Yeah. I would very much enjoy that. And I appreciate you having me on today.
well, where can people find you and where can people buy the book and all that good stuff?
So the book is available uh, in paperback form on Amazon. And by the end of this week, it will also be available in Kindle edition on Amazon.com. If you just type either my name or the title of the book, Keep Fighting, into the search bar, you'll get the results. I also include a link on my Instagram at both Philadelphia Barbell Club and at Keep Fighting HQ.
Yeah, so I did order it and it came in today. So it's newly released and I'm interested to read it because I do have a flight this week, so I'll be flying somewhere, flying back, and we'll have some downtime to hopefully actually dig in a little bit. And you definitely put a lot of time into this book. It's not short, but it's easy to read. Like, and so
I
I think
appreciate you
that
saying that. Yeah,
I,
they're
I yeah, I don't want someone to, because sometimes people can look at it and be like, "Oh, this is over 300 pages. I don't want to," but it
no.
looks intimidating and it's a topic that could be nitty gritty, but it's actually it flows, and I think that that's the one thing about this sport is steroids too. Like that one was a little bit different, like more investigative journalist type style. But it was a page turner, so like you could read 100 pages like super quick. It wasn't like a
Mm.
grind, and I think this is the same way. Even though it's more educational, you're still able to read it, and it's like more conversational feeling, and not like while there is evidence and stuff presented, it's not dry, right? So
Yeah, and to help people out, right after the introduction, I include a single page that says, "Here's how to use this book," and I explain, look, you could take one of three pathways. You could jump around. I encourage everybody to read the first section, which is how to think like a champion, which touches upon both the model of challenge and threat and also what current sports psychology tells us about how self talk works and how you can make it beneficial, how perfectionism might be counterproductive, and how traits like optimism and goal setting, and as you mentioned, a growth mindset, will also produce payoffs for you in your weightlifting. And then I say the two sections that follow are about training and competition, and the chapters are very topical in nature. So, for instance, the chapter on how if you really shine in competition, but you're a little more measured in training, how can you work in developing those qualities? So, the athletes could use it as, say, like a kind of troubleshooting guide for themselves as a weightlifter.
hmm
I experience X. I'm going to go see what this book says about this problem. Or I should stop couching it that way. How can I address what I currently do and make it become more productive for me?
yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Well, cool. For those of you out there, check out the book. And for myself, I'm Travis Cooper. You can find me at Travis Cooper 77kg on Instagram. That's probably the best way to reach me. If you know somebody who would like to be on the podcast, if you would like to be on the podcast, let me know topics, questions, so that we can keep providing content for you. Thank you guys. Have a good night.